The movie begins with a girl named Cairo, who is left alone by her lawyer parents working abroad. She is living alone in a Tennessee mansion and uses writing as her escape. Cairo often wears miniskirts and high socks, and she travels through the woods to reach her school. Upon arriving at school, Cairo encounters her class teacher, Jonathan Miller, a middle-aged man who failed as an author and turned to teaching. Despite their age difference, Cairo secretly admires Jonathan and purposely takes his class. One day, Cairo arrived early to class and surprised Jonathan by mentioning that she had already read the coverage for the entire semester, as it involved 12 books. While they were talking, Winnie, a repeating student of Jonathan, suddenly arrived. Winnie is also a close friend of Cairo, who immediately invited her to eat. After the two left, the curious Jonathan approached Cairo's desk to inspect the books she was reading. While reading, Boris, Jonathan's friend, arrived, took the book Jonathan was reading, and teased him by reading the explicit content out loud. Despite Jonathan's attempts to stop him, Boris persistently continued. One of the things that caught Boris's attention was a book written by Jonathan. Jonathan was also surprised to learn that Cairo had a copy of his book. Upon arriving home, Jonathan found his wife, Beatrix, busy on her laptop. He tried to talk to her, but it was evident that she was extremely busy. He called her directly and excitedly shared that one of his students was voluntarily reading his book. However, their conversation was interrupted by Jonathan's colleague, Amy, who called. After the call, Jonathan whispered erotic things in his wife's ear, and they drank, getting turned on. However, just as they were about to proceed further, Amy called again, leaving Jonathan feeling disappointed and unsatisfied. The next day, Jonathan recounted his weekend to Boris, mentioning that it was not a good one. Boris then made fun of him by sharing his own experience while talking in the field. They spotted Cairo walking out of the woods. Jonathan, feeling sexually frustrated, stared at her as she approached. As Cairo got closer, she took off her earphones and greeted them. The two asked her if she wasn't scared to pass through the woods, to which she replied that she was the scariest thing there. Hearing this, Jonathan laughed. In the locker room, Winnie pretended to have dropped her belongings. Boris, aware that she did it intentionally, approached her to ask what she needed. It was evident that she was trying to charm Boris because there was a great issue with her. Cairo noticed this and told Winnie that she had a lot of nerve. At Cairo's house, the two friends hung out in her room. Cairo was troubled about her college admission because she had to answer a question about her greatest achievement. Unable to think of one, Cairo asked for Winnie's help. Winnie tried to give Cairo ideas, but everything seemed too normal. Suddenly, Winnie suggested that Cairo should try to charm their teachers and write an essay about it. Confused, Cairo mentioned the February 20th, 2024 age gap between them and questioned the idea. However, Winnie continued to convince Cairo that it was normal. She even added that Jonathan seemed like a nice and gentle man, making him a good choice for Cairo's first time, so that she wouldn't feel any pain. Winnie continued to play with Cairo's mind, making her more curious about sex. Winnie even pointed out that she noticed Jonathan's lingering glances at Cairo, which made her feel flattered and embarrassed. Days passed, and Cairo's curiosity about sex continued to grow. It increased to the point where she wanted to experience it during class. Cairo always gazed at Jonathan, and her desire for him was noticeable. Suddenly, Jonathan came from behind and whispered to her to go to his office after class. In his office, Jonathan chatted with Boris and invited him to have dinner with his wife. Boris agreed and continued to be playful, dancing before leaving. After Boris left, Jonathan attempted to mimic his dance, and that's when Cairo caught him dancing. They both laughed and proceeded to discuss Winnie. Jonathan was impressed by the friendship they had and continued talking about Cairo's living situation. They sat down and talked about what Cairo had written. Jonathan was so impressed that he memorized it. Cairo felt flattered and delighted to learn that Jonathan paid attention to her. Jonathan wanted Cairo to write another short story, but this time he suggested highlighting her favorite author. If she did this, Jonathan promised to exempt her from the midterm. Jonathan gave Cairo a topic, and she immediately accepted. In the midst of their conversation, Cairo suddenly brought up that she had read Jonathan's book. She expressed her liking for it and quoted some content from the book. Jonathan was touched upon hearing this, realizing that his less-known book gained attention. Jonathan invited Cairo to meet over the weekend to discuss the short story further. Later that day, the three of them had dinner while drinking alcohol at the bar. Winnie approached them to take their orders. After she left, Beatrix asked if Winnie was the student Jonathan was referring to. Jonathan said no, but it is evident that Beatrix is jealous. She began expressing her frustrations to Jonathan, attacking his dreams and humiliating him in front of Boris. On the weekend, Cairo went to their meeting place. While she was looking for Jonathan, he appeared behind her and whispered. He sat beside her and engaged in conversation. Jonathan informed her that they had been doing this for a long time, enhancing their skills in literature. While a man named Elliot was reciting poetry in front, Cairo stole glances at Jonathan, who was attentively listening. Afterward, they discussed Elliot's performance. The two exchanged glances while Cairo smoked. She offered it to Jonathan, and he promptly accepted. The next day, as the friends were talking again in their usual place, Cairo arrived wearing seductive clothes. Boris asked her about it, but Cairo ignored him and brought them coffee. When Boris left, Cairo sat next to Jonathan. The growing closeness between them was noticeable as they played and teased each other and shared cigarettes. On the way to class, Jonathan received a text from his wife inviting him on a weekend getaway. He was delighted, especially when his wife mentioned that it's his turn to ride her. After class, Cairo immediately approached him to discuss her short story. However, Jonathan appeared in a hurry, eager to be with his wife, recklessly approving of her writings. After Jonathan left, Winnie started playing around in the classroom. Boris arrived, looking for Jonathan. Instead of telling Boris where Jonathan was, Winnie continued to flirt with Boris and seduced him by placing his phone inside her cleavage. Meanwhile, Cairo was searching for her phone, as it had gone missing. In the meantime, Jonathan's plans kept getting postponed due to Amy's constant calls to Beatrice. Jonathan's phone rang inside his bag and he answered it, only to be surprised to hear Cairo on the other end. She told Jonathan that she had accidentally placed her phone in his bag. The two of them talked while Jonathan's frustrated and disappointed wife was also on the phone, unable to have a weekend getaway. Jonathan volunteered to bring Cairo's phone to her house, and she warned him about the incoming rain. While on his way, a heavy downpour suddenly began. Upon arriving, he saw Cairo walking out of her front door wearing a seductive dress in the pouring rain. Jonathan stood there, and Cairo approached him. The two locked eyes and, due to Jonathan's pent-up passion, they passionately embraced and kissed in the pouring rain. After the intense moment, both of them were left in a daze, with Jonathan's mind seemingly wandering. Suddenly, Cairo sent Jonathan his midterm exam, snapping him out of his daydream. His wife asked him to leave her alone since she was getting distracted, so Jonathan left and went to a small house outside their home to stay. He immediately printed Cairo's finished work and began reading it, captivated by the engaging story with adult content. When it reached the climax of the story, Jonathan became excited as he imagined Cairo in the scene, eager to satisfy his lust. Jonathan quickly unzipped his pants and masturbated. The next day, Cairo entered excitedly, wearing a dress to captivate Jonathan even more. However, when she entered, it seemed like Jonathan's attitude had changed. He walked into the classroom and didn't greet her as before. Concerned, Cairo asked him if everything was okay. Jonathan expressed his disappointment with what Cairo had done, in contrast to what he felt about her writing. He showed that he didn't like it, because it contained explicit content and was inappropriate. Cairo explained that the issue was about them, but Jonathan continued to reject what she had done. Cairo made attempts to explain, but Jonathan refused to listen. Frustrated, Jonathan decided to reject both Cairo's paperwork and their relationship. Cairo tried to unveil Jonathan's true feelings, but he insulted her work and regretted trusting her. Upon hearing this, Cairo had an outburst of anger and insulted Jonathan in return, stating that he was merely envious of her accomplishments. She went on to call his writings mediocre and boring. However, Jonathan remained firm in their relationship as teacher and student, further angering Cairo. She became even angrier and dared Jonathan to fail her in the midterm exam. Upset and heartbroken, Cairo quickly went home and sought solace with Winnie, while crying over Jonathan's betrayal. Meanwhile, Jonathan returned home in despair and started drinking. Beatrice noticed this and approached her husband, inquiring about the problem. Initially, Jonathan didn't disclose the issue, but eventually confessed that it involved his student. He expressed disappointment with the submitted short story due to its inappropriate content. Intrigued, Beatrice wanted to know more about the content and had Jonathan recite it. As Jonathan reached the story's climax, Beatrice became aroused and passionately kissed him. Just as things were about to escalate, Boris suddenly arrived. Jonathan was left hanging and quickly excused himself to go to the toilet. Meanwhile, Cairo continued to vent to Winnie, believing that Jonathan was merely pretending. On the other hand, Winnie engaged in a chat with Boris, who showed no interest in her. She attempted to provoke him, but it had no effect. Seeing this, Cairo decided to make out with Winnie, with a plan in mind to send the pictures to Boris. The two undressed their tops and took pictures of themselves kissing. Boris received the pictures, excused himself, and left the principal's office. Boris then called and handed the pictures to Jonathan, informing him that news had reached the authorities about something happening between Jonathan and Cairo. Denying the accusation, Jonathan told his wife that it wasn't true. However, Beatrice threatened him, stating that if it were true, he could lose not only his job but also his wife. The next day, Cairo did not show up for class, as she was in the principal's office talking to Joyce. During the class, Winnie's sadness was evident. After class, she approached Jonathan and tearfully described how important Cairo was to her. However, Jonathan remained unaffected, ignoring her attempts to guilt-trip him. Later on, the vice principal invited both of them to the office for an interview about what happened. The principal interviewed Cairo first, so she would know the right questions to ask Jonathan without hiding anything. Cairo revealed everything that happened. When it was Jonathan's turn, he displayed uneasiness and guilt. At the end of the interview, Joyce noticed Cairo's consistent statements and decided to suspend Jonathan. Upon leaving the office, Boris approached Jonathan expressing his disappointment and warned him to know his boundaries before their escalated conflict. Boris then left to give him some space. When Jonathan got home, he reported to Beatrix that he got suspended. Beatrix quickly asked if something happened, but Jonathan denied it, only mentioning that he gave special privileges to Cairo. Beatrix didn't believe him and continued to confront him, bombarding him with questions until she finally caught him. She asked if Jonathan has developed feelings for Cairo, and he stopped and did not deny it. The two argued, shouting and insulting each other. They began to point out each other's faults and exchanged hurtful words. The pent-up frustrations began to surface as they let it all out. At the end, Beatrix walked out with a plan in her mind to divorce him. Meanwhile, Winnie confronted Cairo about the possibility of Jonathan losing his job because of her. Cairo, unaffected by these concerns, stated that it was her greatest achievement and even included it in her college essay. She told Winnie that Jonathan had underestimated her, so she was doing this to get back at him. As the movie concluded, Cairo's essay depicted the potential fate of Jonathan in his marriage, work, and their relationship.